Okay. Can y'all hear me? Is this hot? All right. It's good to see everyone tonight. Hope everybody is having a good week. It's getting hot again outside. I think it's going to be up in the 90s this weekend. That may be the last go-round of that. For those of you who were maybe not here or didn't read your homework, we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 9 and 10. Tonight, a little bit of review over the past couple of weeks. We have had Solomon building the temple and also the construction of his own, you call it palace, whatever, his dwelling place. A lot of business with the Phoenicians in dealing with Hiram of Tyre. We're going to see him come up again in your reading tonight. And so a monumental thing. And then last week we spent all of our time talking about chapter 8 and this dedication of the temple and this consecration, if you will, of the temple. And so tonight we're just finishing that prayer by Solomon, and we see the response by God. And we see this typical formula that we see throughout our lessons so far, where the Lord says, hey, I am with you. My name is on this place. I will bless you. I will keep Israel. Your descendants will sit on the throne forever if you obey my commandments, my laws, and you walk in the ways of my servant David, your father, so on and so forth. This typical formula that we see repeated often, there are conditions. And we're going to talk a little bit tonight about that in the context of like a suzerain vessel type relationship. And what I mean by that is very much like the book of Deuteronomy is laid out. The book of Deuteronomy is laid out in a pattern very similar to vassal treaties of the ancient Near East. And so with some variation, obviously. But what a suzerain is somebody who may be like a ruling empire, like let's just say the Neo-Assyrians, for example, and they subjugate another nation, and they don't conquer them, they don't wipe them out, but they agree to be under their authority, and so they become a vassal nation. And in these things, in these agreements, typically, just like you see in Deuteronomy, there's a recounting of the relationship together, the history of how we got here. Then there are conditions laid out. There are blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. And then there's a ratification process that you have. And if you read Deuteronomy, where the next generation of Israelites who are the children of those, or those who were younger than 20 years old when they failed to go into the promised land the first time, and their children and their grandchildren or whatnot are hearing and essentially entering into the covenant a second time. Deuteronomy is not the original name of that book. The original name of that book is These Are the Words in Hebrew, Debarim. Is what that is called in Hebrew. Deuteronomy is a word that means second law. And so we see this second giving of the law. And so this here, in the way that we think about it, Israel is a vassal of our sovereign Lord, of Yahweh. And Yahweh is in charge. Yahweh has a history with these people, and he has made an agreement with them, the covenant that we just spoke of, and there are conditions to that where there is a good outcome, if there's obedience and adherence and continuing to remain in submission to the ruling suzerain, or there are conditions of curses and destruction and woe is me type things if obedience is not followed. And so we see this numerous times. Solomon has been warned and told what he needs to do. Throughout our reading so far, I mean, the story of Solomon really takes up about half of the book of 1 Kings. And so he's been told numerous times. And I want you to be thinking about a couple of things as we go into the lesson here, and we may have a chance to give some feedback on that as well. If you think about why so many times is that recorded and that the Lord says it to Solomon. We're going to see that this is the second time the Lord has appeared to him in a visionary type situation and said something. Why is it so important that gets recorded, that formula, time and time again? And then also, as we review Solomon's wealth and all this conversation about wealth, why is it that the book of the Kings and the author of that book, by inspiration, really does pile it on and emphasize Solomon's great wealth. I mean, it's almost obnoxious, really, how much it is emphasized and talked about. I want you to be thinking about maybe why is that the case as intended for the later audience that would be reading this. Obviously, this is not written to contemporaries. It's written sometime between the time of Solomon and the time of the exile, and most likely long after the time of Solomon and during the exile, at least in its final form, this book. Why was this so important to record? Because it really doesn't have like this holy value, if you will, but I want you to be thinking about that as we go through this. So we see that Yahweh responds. There's a prayer and a plea has been made to God about this temple, this magnificent moment in Israel's history when the temple is finally established in the city of God, Jerusalem. And the temple is consecrated and made holy by Yahweh. He says, I am putting my name on this. I have consecrated the house that you have built. It says in chapter 9, verse 3, and my eyes and my heart and my name will be there till all eternity in that way. And so that's only if the conditions are met. And so in this relationship to this suzerain and vassal, he says, there's a blessing here. I will do all these things and keep this house. I'll establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised your father David, saying, there shall not fail you a successor on the throne of Israel. But then in verse 6, if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and statutes that I've set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I'll cut off Israel from the land that I have given them. And ultimately, spoiler alert, that is what Solomon does, and that is what the nation of Israel does. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the next couple of chapters next week and looking through this. The duty of the vassal, the duty of Israel, and really the duty of Solomon to lead Israel to do is obedience, piety, and loyalty to Yahweh. There is no middle ground. There's no leniency here. He has to do these things. Now, I think God shows a great deal of patience with Israel as far as cutting them off out of the land. Eventually, you're going to have to go on and read into 2 Kings to get that, or you can attend the Sunday morning auditorium class. That's what they're talking about, or going to be talking about in there. But there's nothing that's wishy-washy about this. And I think sometimes that Christians look back at the Old Testament and have a tendency to think, well, God sure was harsh back then. He sure doesn't seem to be very forgiving or flexible. He is not flexible in the New Testament either. As a matter of fact, I am more afraid of the anger of God when I reject the Son that He gave, who got butchered and mutilated on a cross and got provided forgiveness for all humankind, the greatest act of grace that's ever been done, because we're only talking about a very, very minute amount of people here in the world, in Israel. I'm going to spit on that. I'm going to shun that. I don't have, at least what God says to Israel is, I'm going to kick you out of the land, and the temple and this city will be destroyed. That's a far cry from you're going to go to hell forever. I am way more afraid of the Lord as He is presented in violating this covenant or never entering into it or taking myself out of it because of my lack of faithful behavior in obedience to God. I'm way more afraid of going to hell than I am some city being destroyed. We should think about it in a different viewpoint. And I think sometimes the world thinks about the Old Testament, much harsher God, much more violent God. We have a very patient God, but in the end, it's not a nonviolent situation when we see what happens to those who don't obey Him either. So every covenant has these obligations, and we have obligations in our covenant as well. The blessing that you have, this is what any king in the ancient world wants to hear, any king in the modern world wants to hear, any king in the Middle Ages wants to hear, your dynasty will go on forever. And it is true that a son of David sits on the throne of Judah, even in the time of the divided kingdom. And so God really kind of keeps His promise, even though He really doesn't have to, because they violated these things. He still is very, very good to them in approaching it. And so the enduring Davidic dynasty, that's music to Solomon's ears. That's what he wants to hear. That's what he wants to happen. But in the end, he doesn't want it that bad. And he makes some terrible, terrible mistakes. And it winds up having long-running consequences for the people of Israel. The curses, if you do not obey me, are exile, abandonment, destruction, and shame. Now, we often say things like, God, don't forsake me. God, don't leave me. God, please be with me. And we mean that in a very spiritual sense. Whereas I think that ancient Israel would hear, just like any other ancient Near Eastern peoples whose deities said, we will forsake you. Well, they didn't really say anything because they didn't have any conversations with them. But that they believed if their gods weren't with them, then the rain wouldn't fall and the crops would dry up and the animals wouldn't be born and their enemies would trounce all over them if they were abandoned by their deities. And so when we think about that saying, I'm going to abandon you, I'm going to leave you, I'm not going to be in this temple anymore, I'm going to abandon this dwelling place that you built. These are terrible things for Solomon to hear. I mean, this is the sky is falling if Yahweh is not with us. And as we see, he even says people are going to look upon this mess and they're going to know that I forsake you because of what you did. He says, and this house, talking about the temple, will become a heap of ruins. Another spoiler alert, but we're not going to read 2 Kings, so we're not going to get into that. This temple is destroyed. It is completely destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians, not really about 400 some odd years, maybe 350, 400 years after this time. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to the land and to this house? I really wish our translations didn't say the Lord. I really wish they would just say Yahweh. Because when we say the Lord, we almost think about it like a position or something. This is the name of God. Why has Yahweh done this to the land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned Yahweh their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore, Yahweh has brought all this disaster upon them. It's going to be recognized by people of what happened here, and really even people who may not be worshipers of Yahweh. It's not unusual. We'll talk about this when we talk about the Queen of Sheba here in just a minute. It's not at all unusual that people outside of Israel would recognize that there was a God over Israel. But that doesn't mean they were monotheist all of a sudden. They don't have any problem with there being multiple gods at all. I don't think the Queen of Sheba had any problem recognizing that, yes, there's a God over Israel, and his name is Yahweh, and he has blessed their leader with great wisdom and great riches and trade routes and success as a nation. But that doesn't mean that they're committed to the Lord like, Solomon was supposed to be committed to the Lord. But he says, and this becomes true. The Lord keeps his promises, right? He keeps his promises, good or bad. And we need to look upon this. When Paul told the Roman audience, we can look at back this and we can, these scriptures that were written before, written for our learning, they are written so that you will know God will keep his promises. Otherwise, I don't believe anything in the New Testament. If I don't believe God's going to keep his promises, I don't believe he's going to send Jesus back. I don't believe he's going to take me to heaven one day. I've got to believe in those promises, and these are promises that I know came true even from secular history. I don't even need the Bible to tell me those things came true. And this witness that was upon them by a pagan people when the Babylonians did this. So a little bit of listing here as we kind of leave this and go back into Solomon's building projects. In addition to the possession of wealth being a gauge of success of a king, so much so is their ability to build. And we think about the mighty resurrection machines in the Egyptian desert, built a full 1,000 years before Moses was a glimmer in his daddy's eye. These massive burial chambers known as the Great Pyramids at Giza. And we think about the other constructions that we see at Abu Simbel, other places around Egypt and other nations, building great things that last a long time and have lasted a long time, much longer than us Americans can make anything last, is limestone construction in the middle of the desert on a solid foundation. Is that this is a great thing that the king has been blessed by God, are able to build things. There's a reason that Herod is called Herod the Great. It's because he was a great builder not because he was a great military commander or really a very moral individual per se. He was a great builder of things and made many great things, including his own mausoleum. For those who have been to Israel, you've probably seen some of these things, the ruins of Caesarea Maritima, other places that Herod built, and Herod built a temple. He improved upon, not this temple, but the temple that would be built by Zerubbabel and others when they returned from exile that we can read about in the book of Ezra. And so it's another accolade that's given to Solomon here in this recounting of his great success is that he was a great builder. And so one of the things that he does that's interesting is good old Hiram, who has been a supplier of lumber for the construction of the temple, he gives him 20 cities up in Galilee. And so that brings back memories of the province that Jesus is from. I don't know if that name called Galilee is somewhat anachronistic or if that's what it was called in the days that the book of Kings was written. But it's up in the northern parts of Israel. And these 20 Galilean cities, most scholars think this was kind of given as a buffer around, I would call it maybe the modern day, the ancient equivalent of the Sudetenland around Czechoslovakia. That was a buffer against Nazi Germany that eventually got taken over by Nazi Germany. But this is a buffer of cities. Well, Hiram is unimpressed with these, and he names them Kabul. We don't know exactly what that name means. It's probably of Phoenician origin, but I think we might call it garbage or no thanks, but no thanks. I appreciate the ghetto of Galilee that you have put upon me in this way. So some people don't know if it is an assertion by Solomon that, hey, Hiram, you still really are my vassal. Or there's a concern about Hiram and making sure we have a good buffer between them. So we're going to have kind of this land that I'm going to give him, and maybe it keeps him satisfied. But we don't have any knowledge that Hiram was some sort of expansionist king of the Phoenician people. But maybe it's just a gift to him, and it's kind of one of those gifts that, you know, it's almost like regifting something. They're really not worth anything, but you gave them to him anyway. But he gives them, Hiram's opinion is not too high of that, but he keeps on supplying Solomon with stuff. We have this is always interesting. I always hate to put things in modern terms, especially biblical measurements. I can't stand when biblical measurements are changed into English. But this is going to be fun because I want to give you a little order of magnitude. I'm going to do this twice. I had to revise this presentation because last time I taught this, gold was only $2,500 an ounce. Now it's $3,670 an ounce today at closing. And so I said, well, I got to redo the math because now it's worth more money. But one thing, this kikar, most of your translations probably render it talent. We're not exactly sure if that's an equivalent. A talent was around 75 pounds. That probably depends on what nation you were measuring your talent in. But when you think about him giving him 120 kikar of gold, it's about 518 million as of September 25. See, I have to date this because I'll teach this again in 3 years. And gold may be cheaper or it may be more. But this is just giving you an order of magnitude. And then when we think about later, about 420 of that, we're measuring up to around 1.8 billion. Now, I'm going to get David Burker, our resident accountant, to check my math later on. But it's just interesting to think about the order of magnitude. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. And to most of you in this room, maybe except perhaps, you know, just Kevin here, $518 million is a lot of money. But Kevin just laughs at that amount of money. There's nothing for him. But we think about 1.8 billion seems like a lot of money, and probably so because there's no reason to report it here and attribute it to this great tribute given to Solomon and Solomon's great wealth if it would it have been perceived as very, very rich in the day and time that it was written. And we'll talk a little bit today that's not an enormous amount of money in today's really government world. We think about his building and military accomplishments. We have the palace that we've talked about. We have the temple at 20 years in combined construction time for those. In the Millo, which is like a citadel or a palace terrace. His Pharaoh's daughter, it's in verse 24, chapter 9, she goes up from the city of David to her own house that Solomon had built for her. Then he built the Millo. I don't know where that word comes from or exactly a whole lot about that, but his building of that. He also built a wall around Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be challenging geography without a wall because it's set up in mountains. It's not easy to invade a city that's up in mountains. It's easier to besiege a city that may be up in mountains in some certain cases. But he builds a wall around Jerusalem. He also builds cities at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. We see that Gezer, or Geyser, however you want to say that, is a city that had been destroyed by the Pharaoh of Egypt. He rebuilt that. Megiddo is a very strategically located city that is in the Jezreel Valley near a pass into the mountains. A ancient city that we see battles on. Josiah, the king of Israel, the king of Judah, really great guy, probably the best king of all the kings of Judah, is killed in battle there by a Pharaoh of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho II. Megiddo is a place where many battles have happened. As a matter of fact, it's symbolically used in the book of Revelation. Har Megiddo is the hill of Megiddo. Armageddon is a manufactured word that we have made up from the Hebrew Har Megiddo. It is a very strategic city, but not very big. If you see cities, I know that Don's probably been to Megiddo in some of his travels over there. We're talking about a village, really, in size of what we'd have today. But very important strategic city. You want to have that built up on your northern border. And so he was very wise in that. Not to mention all the store cities, military bases. And then what's interesting, just before the Queen of Sheba comes to visit, is naval forces. As we see at the end of chapter 9, he builds a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is on Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea. And I'll give you a map here in a second. In the land of Edom, Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who are familiar with the sea. So Hiram sends in his marines. Together with the servants of Solomon, they went to Ophir and imported from there 420 talents of gold. That's what I gave you a minute ago. It's $1.8 billion today, roughly, which they delivered to King Solomon. It's no accident that right after this we have the Queen of Sheba coming to visit. Also, we have listed here that the slave forces. And it's careful that the author of the book of Kings points out that he may have used forced labor from among the Israelites, but he did not enslave the Israelites. And there's a big difference between forced labor and we'll talk about that, especially when we talk about Rehoboam's accession to the throne. Different between forced labor and enslavement. Slavery implies ownership, and we see that some of the people who surround the slaves that he made come from cities around that area. The Amorites, the Hittites, Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, who are not of the people of Israel, it tells us in chapter 9, verse 20. But he didn't enslave the people of Israel, but he did put the people of Israel to forced labor. And we'll expand on that a little bit more when we talk about Rehoboam here in a few weeks. All right, so we have a visit from the queen, and this is not accidental at all, I don't think, because we think about the geography. Some scholars, I guess maybe most or many, would think that Sheba was the southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. Others think it may have been at the Horn of Africa or around Ethiopia or somewhere along that way. This area down here in modern-day Yemen is where many people think that this is. Now, of course, someone who controls that territory controls trade through the strait between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden on the other side of it. They wouldn't have called it necessarily the Gulf of Aden at that time. But this very strategic location, this is what you would want to control one side of this or the other. It's kind of like controlling the Straits of Gibraltar. So if you control that or you control both sides and people try to ship through there, you can just pound them to death with artillery. And so it's very important that she controls it. But it's interesting that this happens right after Solomon puts in a fleet right about here, and he begins to trade with Ophir, which we don't know where that is, but it's somewhere likely on the Arabian Peninsula, and he's beginning to travel through there in gold. Many people think this queen is like, okay, I've got a new trade partner or a trade competitor that is beginning to traffic and expand his territory and his trade ships into the Red Sea. And perhaps there's a little bit of political intrigue about that as she goes to visit him. Now, certainly, the text paints the picture very clearly that she's also amazed and has heard of Solomon's legend, which has gone before him, about his wisdom and his wealth, and she wants to go check this out. But I think it's a valid thought, perhaps speculative, but a valid thought that it's tied right to this scene that we see before it that Solomon puts a fleet of ships into the sea. We don't see very many forces or times of Israel where they are maritime power at all. Even though they occupy a land that has a coast along the Mediterranean, they're not known to have a powerful fleet of ships. And obviously, they couldn't even staff the ships. They have to get the Phoenicians, which were prolific traders and people with great seamanship in the Mediterranean, to come and to staff this thing. So I don't think it's just pure interest that the Queen of Sheba came up there to see him. And she brings all these things with her to honor Solomon and brings him all these gifts because perhaps there's a new game in town known as Israel that has begun to trade up and down the coast of the Red Sea. Politics here, it could be very strategic, as I mentioned, for trade relations. What is the proof of wisdom? Now, wisdom in the ancient Near East is a very complicated topic that I myself have not personally studied very, very deeply. It has much richer of a meaning and more nuance perhaps than what we define wisdom at. Is typically we say wisdom is knowing the right decision to make or having the knowledge or the life experience to look around corners and think through things logically and be able to take in a lot of information and say, oh, I need to make sure I be careful about this. Not young people who rush in where angels fear to tread and just not caring about consequences. That is a great aspect of wisdom. But wisdom, I don't think in our society today is as treasured of a thing as it was for the ancient people. I also don't think we connect it as strongly to it being given by God. Even though James would tell us, right, if any of you lacks wisdom, what should you do? Ask God. Now, certainly James is not contemporary with Solomon, but James was still in that mindset. And we think about, what did Solomon ask for from God? And was given wisdom. He, in the end, does not choose to use it in his relationship with women and his choice of idolatry. He doesn't exercise that wisdom, but we have seen in our earlier studies, he really has supernatural level of wisdom, but something that was cherished by people and would be honored by others. And so for the Queen of Sheba to see how much Solomon had been blessed, his wealth, his strategic power in the region, the way that he had taken this no-name group of people who had just a few hundred years before been just a loose confederacy of tribes into a notable and noteworthy people in the ancient Near East. I'm going to come check this out. And she even acknowledges how Yahweh, their God, has blessed them. And so the value placed on wisdom, I don't know if I want to say it's equal to money, but I wish that we valued it as much as we do value wealth, is to teach and encourage wisdom. But it's a very, very deep subject and something to be studied, especially when we think about ancient Near Eastern thought and how they looked at wisdom. It was breathtaking. Solomon, of course, put on a big dog and pony show. That's ancient Hebrew, dog and pony show. Solomon would have no idea what I'm talking about, but literally in some ways he did have animals and other things present. Puts on a big show. This is pretty normal. You know, we roll out the red carpet. We put on a big show for foreign dignitaries and people that visit, and they do the same for us in that nature. So it's pretty big showing to impress her. And in some ways, this may be posturing, political posturing in some ways, to show strength and power and Solomon's resources available to him, in addition to showing how much his God was with him to impress this woman. And what she says is, man, it's bigger than I thought. The reality exceeds the reputation that you have. When she says in verse 4, she observed all the wisdom of Solomon, including the house that he built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, his clothing, his valets, burnt offerings. There was no more spirit in her. It took her breath away, we might say in our modern vernacular. It was just awe-inspiring, astounding what she had seen. And so she says that the report is even more accurate than I thought. And they do exchange gifts here of gold, spices for gold, lumber, precious stones. And so there's a trading around back and forth. She's also showing a little bit of her prowess, a little bit of her prosperity, what her kingdom has to offer, perhaps even searching for a trade partner for things that maybe he has, like Hiram's lumber. That there's probably not a lot of lumber on the end of the Arabian Peninsula. And so she may be looking for someone who can help her make connections to Phoenician lumber and whatever other trade goods there may be in that region, or iron ore, whatever there may wind up being. And she's got things that she can offer back in return. She says, happy are your men, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever, and he has made you king, that you may do what? That you may do what every king is responsible for before their deity. You may execute justice and righteousness, that you'll keep things in order, that you'll do the right thing. And this is a great blessing here that she puts on there. Some of your translations may say, happy are your women. And the reason that it says that, if you may have that footnoted, I think the New Revised Standard Version has happy are your women, because the Greek translation of the Old Testament and the Syriac translation of the Old Testament do have women there. Guniakos is what I think it is in Greek. They have that there, and I can understand Hebrew and understand the Greek and Syriac translations are older than the Hebrew text your Old Testaments are based on. So that's why some of your translators have chosen to put in happy are your women. That was probably true. I would bet that Solomon, now that's a lot of women to keep happy. Solomon had a lot of women to keep happy, as we'll talk about in the next chapter. I don't know how any man can pull that off, but he's able to pull it off. How you keep 1,000 women happy must have a lot of wisdom, more beyond what I have. I have trouble just keeping one happy. But if it says that, there's a reason that there are some ancient translations that are very old, like the Septuagint in Greek, would have women there. It doesn't change the meaning of the text. What this woman is saying is, hey, everybody is happy-go-lucky around here. They love it. They love you. They're blessed. And isn't everyone when the economy is booming? You know, everybody is happy when the economy is booming, except forced labor, except the people that are engaged in forced labor. But he sees all his servants and the things that are before him. And so let's talk a little bit about this kingdom of wealth, because now we go back into the writer has spent a little bit of time glorifying Solomon, showing how he was a great builder. Now he is an impressive king that even impresses foreign dignitaries and powers. And now we're going to get back more into the cash flow situation. The base income that we see is 666 talents or kikar of gold each year in 14. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. Calculated today on the value of gold today is about $2.9 billion. Billion. Now, that sounds like a lot of money. That is enough for you to buy 65,000 ownership in the largest company in the world, NVIDIA, which is worth $4 trillion today in market capitalization. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but I wish I owned that much of that company. I would have sold a little bit today, but I wish I owned that much money. Or even more impressive, your government spends that amount of money in 3.8 hours based on the current $6.4 trillion budget of the United States government. Mr. Burker can check my math on that. I rounded up a little bit, Mr. Burker, on that, in just one decimal place. So it's always interesting when modern-day politicians talk about saving $5 billion. Great! You saved almost 5 hours of spending today. But that number is impressive to people whose salaries and total household incomes are 5 or 6 digits long versus that much money. So it's really not an enormous amount of money. And so why do I say that? I say that because it's not unbelievable. You know, some people will look at these numbers and say, there's no way that he could bring in that much gold in a year. Yeah, probably, especially if you are trading with people on all sides of your country, on the Mediterranean. Hiram's giving you money. You're now maybe trading with the Queen of Sheba. You just brought in 420 talents of gold in one little trip down Ophir that we read about at the end of chapter 9. So it's not ridiculous. And I say it's not ridiculous because if it translated to $4 trillion, I would say, okay, that sounds a little bit excessive. But it's really not that much, and really even not that much when we think about the gross domestic product of countries that are Israel's size today. We spend more money in 4 hours than the gross domestic product of most of the countries on this planet. And so it's really not that unbelievable. And like I said, these are not exact numbers. I just gave it so that you would recognize that people that say, oh, there's no way, there's that, yes way. I would tell you that the Neo-Babylonians probably hauled in 10 times this amount, and the Persians probably hauled in 10 times this amount of gold. Often you will see war reparations placed on a nation that rebels against an empire like the Persians, and the punishment is 10,000 talents of gold. Okay, that's an astronomical sum of money that is there. 10,000 talents, that's what it takes massive governments to pay, or it's crippling to their economy. So the order of magnitude is not all that strange and not all that crazy, and I want to reinforce that in your mind so you don't think it's unbelievable. Now, there are things that seem to be, in our minds, wastes of money. He did not have a 401k program for his servants and his house people. He did not provide them health insurance. There are many things that the king did not have to provide to his people. There's no welfare system or Social Security or Medicare. Sorry, some of you in this room. But he didn't have to do those things. You really probably didn't live to be 65 anyway for most of these people. But he does make 500 ceremonial shields. Now, you talking about just glamorous to be able to put them. Now, it's important you remember that number when we go and we talk about the later kings of Israel. Because those shields made of gold are turned into a shield of poverty later on. But just 500 shields made out of gold, it's like you got so much stuff you don't even know what to do with it. I'm going, okay, I'll tell you what should we do, Solomon? Let's make some shields out of it. Well, what is a shield? A shield is a military weapon, a symbol of power. There's some debate about maybe what this term means exactly, but also he makes this great throne, an ivory throne, which means he's importing ivory from Africa most likely, and overlaid it with not just gold, but the finest of gold. And the throne has 6 steps. Can you imagine how much this thing probably weighed? And it's got lions on each side of it. 12 lions were standing, each on each end of the step of the 6 steps. Nothing like it was ever made in the kingdom. His drinking vessels were of gold. I kind of wouldn't prefer that because I'd have a real heavy cup. Maybe that's even better than a Stanley thermos. I don't know if it costs any more than a Stanley thermos does these days, but maybe it's like that. The house of the forest of cedar of Lebanon, the vessels were all pure gold. None were silver, not that cheap old silver stuff. But it was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. It's pretty much like silver is just about worthless in this day and time. And so we have these lines and ivory and gold, oh my, that we see on there. So we also see foreign trade. Again, we see gold. Remember, we're not talking about a world with currency. We're talking about a world where you traded things in weight of precious metals or jewels or stones. We see silver. He also trades in animals, both working and exotic animals that we see along these ways. He gathered together chariots and horses. It says in verse 26 that he gathered together 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedars as numerous as the sycamores of the Shephelah. I have no idea what the Shephelah is. Perhaps I could research that, but I really don't know that I want to spend a lot of time on it. Can you imagine 1,400 chariots for a man who lives in a city on a mountain? Okay. Chariots are 100% useless in combat to defend a city on a mountain. You use chariots in battle on plains, on wide open plains where they can maneuver and they can be carried around by the horses. But I mean, this is an absurd number of things. Now, one of the things this harkens us back to in Deuteronomy is the king shall not multiply for himself many horses, chariots, and women. Well, this is already a little bit of a clue into what's coming up in our next chapter here. And so we see that he have a joint trading fleet. He trains in spices, horses and mules, much more year by year in spices. This is just the vision of a prosperous kingdom and trading through all these things. He does also have infantry and mobile weaponry. Now, it is true that he lives in Jerusalem, but yes, Israel had a great deal of plains around it. If you're going to defend around Megiddo, other places in a valley, chariots are handy to have in repelling of them. Now, why do you think that God would not want a king to multiply for himself many chariots and horses? What's that? You want him to depend on God to defend his people, because that's what God's told him, hasn't he? He said, you don't have to worry about your enemies anymore. If you obey, walk in my ways, act like your servant, my servant David, there's no need to arm yourself in these gigantic ways. But he does that. And I begin to talk about maybe his downfall that we go into here at the end. King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Obviously, there is some hyperbole here. There's no king in modern-day Canada that was going to see Solomon, okay? So when we say all the earth, the author is referring to all the lands that they knew. And so this would make me to believe that Queen of Sheba is not the only visitor that came to seek an audience with King Solomon. So we'll finish up a little bit. How many of you guys know what F. Scott Fitzgerald's book, The Great Gatsby, was about? What's it about? I knew you would know. You don't have to give me the whole thing. What time period? The Roaring Twenties, right. Why do we call it the Roaring Twenties? Economic prosperity. Yes. It's interesting that one of the youngest people in the room comes up with that. I know David Berger. He remembers the Roaring Twenties. He was a teenager in those days, and he remembers the speakeasies that he would go to and things in the 20s. This is the Roaring Twenties of Israel. It's always interesting to me that the messianic expectation is to return to the kingdom of David. I wouldn't want to go to the kingdom of David. I'd want to go to the kingdom of Solomon. This is the Gilded Age, if you will, a time when everybody's loving life and everything's going wonderfully. Then what is this date? Black Friday, 1929, the beginning of the Great Depression and the stock market crash, unequaled in human history until most recently the 2008 Great Recession, where we had nearly the same thing happen because of illegal things going on in the housing market. But October 29th, 1929 is coming in chapters 11 and 12. There's going to be an end to this that we have seen time and time again. Israel and Solomon have been told and told and told and told, if you go after other gods, I will not tolerate it. And everything's going to come crashing down. And we're going to see Israel move from all this bragging things. The reason I wanted you to think about beginning a class is, and I mentioned this book because this is really a great tragedy. It's a great tragedy that all of this is going to be squandered. And I think that the Holy Spirit wanted this author to write these things down, this lavish expenditures, the great wealth, the great building, the great majesty, the great wisdom of Solomon, because it magnifies the tragedy. Remember, we are reading ancient literature here. Not fiction, not fiction, not things that are not true, but there is a style to writing in the ancient world, just like there's a style of writing to English literature or anything of that nature. It is magnifying, and the message to later Israel, which we think about people reading in the exile, one thing we don't have a problem with in the New Testament period amongst the Jews is idolatry. They have read and they know. We want that age again. We want to be back in our land. We want to be back in control of our land. We want to be blessed like that again. And we sure are not going to chase after any idols. And so the magnification of all of the things that Solomon was prosperous and it's talking about it, I think is given to us, or given to ancient Israel, and the post-exilic readers, and any reader that's happened ever since that time, it really, really puts the stinger on how terrible it was. And you guys, many of you guys know who studied the Old Testament, you know that we are approaching the time of the divided kingdom. The divided kingdom is Solomon's fault. The end of all of this is Solomon's fault. And when we think about asking God for wisdom and He grants it to us, it is up to us to implement and maintain wise choices. Informed, wise choices. Craig and I were talking today about the concept he's going to preach on Sunday about spiritual discernment out of the book of Philippians and how we learn to discern and think about things. And I think that's very important. for us to do. All right, your homework for next week is 1 Kings 11 through 12. And then you're going to get a break because I'm going to be out of town. And my good friend Lance Williams, excellent teacher, will be in here teaching on some subject. He is yet to tell me what that's going to be, but it don't really matter to me. It'll be great. It'll be a great study for all of you guys. And so you guys have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you